Hello, I'm Wajat Ahmed. I'm visiting faculty at OP Jindal Global University. This module is about HIV and what's the way forward. The intended learning outcomes of the module are, by the end of this chapter, you shall be able to understand the significance of human rights approach in combating HIV/AIDS, to comprehend measures required to be taken for marking an effective response to HIV. The report of the Commission on AIDS in Asia, Redefining AIDS in Asia, Crafting an Effective Response, observes that HIV responses in Asia can easily fit a predictable pattern. At the initial phase, the denial phase response are based on fear of denial, wherein countries try to arrest the epidemic using punitive laws or measures. Then comes the stage of ad hoc response, where the countries introduce more interventions which are often not based on any solid evidence. This is named as the informed phase. Later, the response improves and is based on scientific evidence, although the problems of coverage, prioritization remain. Finally, a mature response is achieved. Governments deploy necessary financial, institutional, and human response to achieve a sustainable and comprehensive HIV response. This chapter enlists certain prerequisites for marking an effective response to HIV/AIDS. In the figure, baseline scenario indicates current HIV programming and effectiveness. Continue and scaled up intervention scenario denotes 80% consistent condom use is achieved among sex workers and clients. Similarly, high levels of risk reduction among men who have sex with men and injecting drug users, and 80% of people in need of antiretroviral treatment receive it. Significance of human rights approach in combating HIV/AIDS. A human rights approach to fighting HIV/AIDS is important because of its following key functionalities: ensuring accountability, promoting advocacy, defining the approaches to programming. Now let's look at ensuring accountability. One of the most significant achievements of the human rights obligations is its ability to ensure accountability. At the least, governments cannot afford to ignore them. Countries signing the international human rights obligations come under pressure from the international community and human rights advocacy groups within the country to enforce the commitments therein. The 2001 Declaration of Commitment on AIDS, the Political Declaration on HIV/AIDS of 2006 and 2011, and the international guidelines on HIV/AIDS and human rights have been crucial, as they have provided an impetus to translate most of the human rights standards into application at national level. However, there is a pressing issue which potentially threatens this functionality. The increasing privatization of governmental functions, as argued by many scholars, threatens to erode legal and democratic accountability. It's important that the governments ensure that these private players, who may be significant players in the lives of people living with HIV, be it in the form of schools, hospitals, places of work, etc., do not end up violating their human rights. Now look at promoting advocacy. One of the most important advantages of having a human rights approach is that it gives an impetus to advocacy groups to mobilize community action to change the existing discriminatory laws, practices, and systems, and to hold governments accountable to their human rights obligations. The concerted efforts of human rights advocacy groups have contributed significantly to the betterment of conditions of people living with HIV and others affected by the epidemic. The numerous cases filed in the courts across India by groups like Lawyers Collective, Human Rights Law Network, etc., to protect the human rights of HIV-infected affected persons and the handing over of responsibility of drafting legislation on HIV to Lawyers Collective by the government all exemplifies the significance of advocacy function of human rights. The efforts by groups like Doctors Without Borders have been significant in exposing the human rights abuses of multinational pharmaceutical giants and safeguarding the rights to health care of people infected by HIV. So now let's look at defining the approaches to programming. Experiences show that HIV/AIDS policies, programs, and other interventions, when based on a rights-based approach, are effective, sustainable, and more inclusive in nature. This is because of the fact that right-based approaches are guided by the needs, experiences, and rights of the community, while also empowering the community to widen the participation and bolster their relationship with law, policymakers, and partner organizations. According to UNAIDS, which has long-term commitment to developing human rights-based approaches to fight HIV, a rights-based approach can help to mitigate the impact of HIV/AIDS as it allows for the creation of a supportive policy, legal, social, and cultural environment in which people infected or affected by HIV/AIDS are able to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development despite their HIV status. The way forward. So what's the way forward? Many experts argue that the HIV epidemic can be ended by 2030. In 2013, UNAIDS converted a group of thought leaders and scientists to define the meaning of ending the AIDS epidemic. According to them, ending the AIDS epidemic means that the spread of HIV has been controlled or contained, and that the impact of the virus in societies and in people's lives has been marginalized and lessened thanks to significant decline in ill health, stigma, deaths, and the number of orphans. It means increased life expectancy, unconditional acceptance of people's diversity and rights, and increased productivity and reduced costs as the impact diminishes. Experience shows that neither medical interventions alone nor using legal responses only can contribute to a sustained and effective response to challenges raised by HIV/AIDS. It inevitably calls for a multi-sectoral approach. Some of the key intervention strategies for marking an effective response to HIV/AIDS are discussed below. In fact, UNAIDS asserts that it's time for us to move from a response mode to mission mode. Let's look at protecting human rights. Protecting human rights needs to be the focus of any HIV interventions to be successful. The advantages of such an approach have been discussed in detail in the above section. Only by empowering populations and wiping away the ingrained structural inequalities can this world move end HIV. Medical interventions can provide sustainable results only when the human rights of the populations most vulnerable to HIV are protected. So, next section is enhanced political engagement. Studies have shown that a strong political commitment and leadership is imperative in effective planning and implementation of HIV responses. Countries with foresighted politicians showing a commitment towards fighting the global epidemic have made great strides towards successful prevention and control of HIV. Experiences show that political commitment has instilled a sense of urgency, created an enabling space for public discussions and involvement of community effectively mobilized public opinion and also led to earmarking of adequate resources for HIV programs. Commission on AIDS in Asia observes that on a general account, political leadership and engagement arises from these factors. A pragmatic and mature sensibility among leaders, as witnessed in the case of Thailand, recognition of a sense of urgency of the situation, like in case of India and China, and pressure from the civil society, like in Philippines. The next section is reaffirming the importance of global coordination. International organizations like United Nations have played a prominent role in initiating and sustaining effective national response to HIV. HIV programs in the developing world depend majorly on the funds coming from international funding agencies and other countries. A concerted global action and coordination can contribute towards sustained and intensified HIV/AIDS response. In 2004, donors, national governments, UN agencies, and other key international organizations entered into a landmark agreement for promoting global coordination. They committed to a 3-1s principle, which is as follows. 1. Agreed HIV/AIDS action framework that provides the basis for coordinating the work for all partners. 1. National AIDS Coordinating Authority with a broad-based multi-sector mandate. 1. Agreed country-level monitoring and evaluation system. These guiding principles aim to ensure national ownership, effective coordination in a transparent manner, and efficient use of resources. Since its formulation, it has been facilitating effective coordination and harmonization of HIV responses. Now let's look at ensuring community engagement. It has now been recognized that effective response to HIV requires treating the people living with HIV as participants in their own destiny and not as victims or passive recipients of assistance in the health promotion principles of 1996 Ottawa Charter on Health Promotion and the subsequent Jakarta Declaration. It was recognized that rather than regarding communities as passive beneficiaries of assistance, people are able to think and act constructively in identifying and solving their own problems. Experience from many countries, including India, demonstrates that organized response to AIDS are often initiated and driven by the people living with HIV, those affected by it, and activists. Community engagement is therefore crucial for an effective response to HIV, including formulation of policies, its effective implementation, and service delivery. Even the simple act of talking about the issues which have been closeted for long empower people living with and affected by HIV. However, the conformist society makes this a daunting task. The Commission on AIDS in Asia has observed that community participation can contribute towards effective responses in the following ways. To cite an example, community models of care have been used by many resource-poor countries to ensure access to antiretroviral drugs. These models demonstrate that involving communities in their health system decisions help address the barriers in accessing treatment to a great extent. Piloted and found to be a success, in many countries they aim at bringing treatment close to people's homes. Through some of these models like appointment spacing and fast-track drug refills, adherence clubs, community ARV distribution points, or PODI's delivery of drugs is arranged at the community level with support peer groups. The International Medical Humanitarian Organization, Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, advocating for community models of care, demonstrate that besides saving patients money and time, these increase peer support, fight stigmatization, and contribute towards empowering the people living with HIV. Now let's look at the section prioritizing interventions. The Commission on AIDS in Asia's analysis of the relative cost of the interventions against the numbers of HIV infections prevented, number of AIDS deaths averted, and scale of income losses avoided indicates that the costlier interventions would prevent only about 1% of new HIV infections. Such inventions, including ensuring blood safety and safe injections, would absorb more than 25% of the estimated total HIV response budget. They classified HIV interventions into 4 categories. Depending on their cost and effectiveness, high cost or high impact antiretroviral treatment programs to prevent mother-to-child transmission, low cost or high impact interventions focused on sex workers and clients, harm reduction programs, prevention programs for men who have sex with men, low cost or low impact mass media AIDS awareness programs, securing property and inheritance rights for women and girls' education, high cost or low impact strengthening of health systems, universal precautionary measures. Their analysis demonstrates that while universal precautions and interventions targeting sex workers and their clients tend to be similar in cost, there is considerable difference with respect to the number of new HIV infections that can be prevented. In comparison to the universal precautions, targeted interventions focused on workers and clients can prevent 7,000 times more new HIV infections with the same amount of money spent. The antiretroviral treatment, on the other hand, falls in the high cost, high impact category. Access to a continuum of antiretroviral therapy, though costly, can save several years of life. On the basis of its analysis, the Commission proposes that interventions of high and known effectiveness, irrespective of their cost, should be prioritized and found out of the allocated budgets. However, this does not mean that other interventions should be left out. These may be of low impact, as the Commission's own classification shows. The case of securing women's property and inheritance were termed low impact intervention due to long-term effects or effects difficult to quantify. Now let's look at addressing structural inequalities. While the above analysis puts some of the interventions focused at dealing with the structural inequalities in the low impact category, experience shows that for a sustained response, the complexities underlying societal factors in HIV needs to be paid attention. It is especially important as any intervention operates in the social, economic, and cultural spaces, which in turn determines its effectiveness. The social drivers of the epidemic, including socioeconomic and gender inequality, discriminatory legal and political systems, etc., calls for a multi-sectoral response to the HIV, along with venturing into efforts to tackle the social drivers of the epidemic. As a first step, an enabling environment for tackling HIV can be created. For instance, interventions such as poverty reduction may take years to show tangible results. However, increasing poverty affects the accessibility to healthcare services. As an immediate step to tackle with the epidemic, governments can create an enabling environment by providing free and subsidized healthcare services. Bringing in law reforms. As a priority, the government should undertake an extensive review of its laws and legal process to ensure that they are in consonance with the human rights standards. Human rights commitments do not end with signing of international instruments. Governments need to repeal the punitive and discriminatory laws and enact laws which enable an effective response to HIV. Criminalizing of HIV transmission and same-sex sexual acts, mandatory disclosure of HIV information, mandatory testing of individuals for HIV, etc. need to be stopped. It's also necessary to bring in reforms in the religious laws and engage in the reviewing of customary practices which have been undermining the rights of vulnerable sections and impairing their access to HIV prevention care and treatment services. For any of these law reforms to be effective, it's important to take the community into confidence. Extensive awareness generation measures can assure the smooth passing and implementation of the law reforms. Now, let's look at the section ensuring accessibility and affordability of life-saving drugs. The Global Commission on HIV and Law, in its aforementioned study on legal framework related to HIV in various countries, have found that some countries, despite the international pressure to prioritize trade over public health, have used law to ensure access to affordable medicine for its HIV-infected populations. There has been a dramatic decrease in the price of first-generation antiretroviral drugs in the recent years owing to the competition given by generic drugs. However, the second and third generation ARVs and the medications for co-infections like hepatitis C continues to remain expensive. Albeit some countries have prioritized public health needs of its population, timely pre-grant oppositions filed by Indian civil society organizations to challenge the secondary patents have given the country's generic medicine producers a boost to advance the production of second-line medicines. Countries like Thailand, Ecuador, and Indonesia have issued compulsory licenses to enable the production or importation of these drugs. The patent regime undoubtedly poses more hindrances to the access to medicines. TRIPS and TRIPS Plus measures outdated patent laws, as in the case of South Africa, and bilateral pressure from developed countries like United States and European Union and pharmaceutical countries are escalating the number of patents and providing stiff resistance to the generic industry. Countries should put into maximum use all the legal safeguards available at their disposal. While safeguarding of the inventor's interests are required, more important is the enforcement of an effective legal intellectual property rights regime consistent with international human rights commitments and public health needs. Let's summarize now. Well, there has been considerable efforts made both internationally and nationally to combat HIV/AIDS. A lot remains to be done. Those states are required to submit reports on their compliance with existing international instruments. The enforcement mechanism still remains weak. Further, the impasses being mostly on protection of civil and political rights, socio-economic and developmental rights get overshadowed. Efforts need to be scaled up to ensure that each and every person living with HIV has access to treatment, care, and services. For ensuring an effective response in combating the epidemic, the socio-economic disadvantages facing the marginalized sections need to be primarily dealt with. A structural transformation with changes in the power equations, reining the society is inevitable in finding sustained solutions to the concerns raised by HIV epidemic. The module ends here. Thank you very much.